Good Monday morning, everyone. Today is March 2nd, 2020, and here is today's Monday Morning Minute. For today, we will, per usual, recap last week's readings. We'll then talk about this week's chapter on increasing student motivation to learn. Then I'll touch on our upcoming assignments. We have our critical response number 6 coming up this week. And then remember that our classroom culture toolkit is due at the end of March 29th to be precise. I just want to make sure that you're aware of that and you have maybe some ideas to move forward on that project. So last week we thought about keeping organized, how to ensure that papers, the endless onslaught of papers, end up where they need to be. And you all shared some really cool ideas that I wanted to just reiterate. Caitlin, I loved the idea of color coding, especially when you have a class in which you have multiple grade levels represented in the same class period. So color coding to make sure you know who is doing what at what time. Seems like a really awesome way to go about it. Doug, your suggestion for digital tools. So instead of dealing with paperwork physically, right, we can at least try to keep things a little bit more organized using tools like Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive, similar things like that. And I also loved the idea of being transparent in the classroom about the necessity of classroom organization. So Doug mentioned involving students, and if any initiative is going to get off the ground in a classroom, there has to be student buy-in, right? And that's something that we've been talking about since the start of the semester, and thinking about the importance of building relationships, the importance of ensuring that students are an active part of the learning process. This should also, in Doug's view, apply to organizational methods, right? Ensuring that students understand why it's important to keep organized and how they can be a critical part of that too. Very cool. And then just some ideas from the Preble article that we read. She talks about the notion of special places for special papers. And with this specifically, I thought it was important to mention when we're talking especially about confidential information, protected information, as we would be when we're talking about IEPs. Of course, it's important that whatever places we choose to store that paperwork are secure and meet all of the FERPA requirements that we're beholden to. So just something to keep in mind. And another suggestion from Preble was just the idea of minimizing handouts, period. So she gives the example, for instance, of, on an assignment worksheet that you might hand out to students, you might also include on the back of that paper the rubric, and then you can use that same paper to score the student's assignment. It just saves you and saves the environment, I suppose, as well, one extra sheet of paper. So thinking about how to, if we have to print things out because, that's how our students learn, that's maybe the way that our school is set up, we're not digitally minded yet, then how can we minimize those handouts? How can we use that sheet of paper to the nth degree? So thank you all so much. We'll keep thinking, and please feel free to use that thread from critical response number 5 to keep sharing ideas. And for this week, we are looking at the role of student motivation in the larger picture of classroom management. So we are about at the halfway point of our semester at this point, and you might have noticed that classroom management, the way that we are talking about it and discussing it, is 99% about creating the most optimal conditions for all students to learn, right? Which will then reduce problematic behavior. So when there is an issue that arises in your class, we want to first think about, sort of a mental checklist, if you will. Have I built strong relationships with students and families? Is my classroom organized, and do students understand that organizational process? And the question posed by this week's readings is my instruction or content engaging and worthwhile for students, right? It's another part of this mental checklist. And there are so many wonderful strategies and figures and things and sort of printables, if you will, that you could take and use in your classroom from this chapter. So I'm excited to hear what you all think. But Jones and Jones proceed from the basic assumption that learning, the instruction, the classroom environment has to be engaging if we want students to stay on task, right? If we want students to actually do the work. So they start with a quote from William Morse, who says, "Adverse student reactions should be expected when classes are dull, teaching is uninspired, and failure is built in. Students' oppositional behavior is a sign of personal health and integrity." I really love that reframing because oftentimes oppositional behavior is seen as a fault, a major fault of the student as an individual, right? And here Morse is saying, well, when these courses aren't offering students anything to be excited about, them acting out is actually healthy. So something to chew on and think about. And if you have thoughts, we can definitely talk about it in this week's discussion board. And Jones later in the chapter say, "We have never met a student who is unmotivated to learn." Again, I love this because it flips around a very common trope that you might hear, and we might have even said ourselves, oh, this kid just totally doesn't want to learn. It's totally unmotivated. And here Jones and Jones are saying, no, actually, all students can be motivated to learn. We've seen all students in some way, shape, or form be motivated to learn something. And the key in our role as teachers is to figure out what will motivate them, right? How can we bring about their buy-in in our course content? Something else to keep in mind, this is a very big chapter with lots and lots and lots of recommendations. It's organized around a list of 12 student academic needs. And they're first introduced on page 224 of the chapter, and then the subsequent, the rest of the chapter is just taking each of these 12 needs and exploring it in depth with, of course, lots of suggestions and ideas for you. So when you're looking and thinking about and reading about Jones and Jones's framing of these needs, you might consider that these could be potential topics for your classroom culture toolkit. Remember, with that toolkit, we're thinking about one particular area of classroom management that we ourselves want to know more about and want to improve upon, perhaps. And so again, just if you're stuck, if you're still kind of rolling that assignment around in your head, not sure really where to go, take a look at those 12 items and consider, are there any there that I could build a toolkit around? I think you could build a toolkit around any of them, but again, the question is motivation. So what interests you when it comes to classroom management? All right, and for this week, we have our critical response number 6 coming up. Please post your initial response by Thursday. We'll do a follow-up post by next Sunday. And you are, as always, welcome to just reflect generally on any parts of the chapter that either provoked you in some way, perhaps positively or negatively. So it can be just a general reflection on the chapter. Or if you'd like a little bit more guidance, here's this week's optional prompt. So again, it centers around figure 7.1 on page 224, those 12 academic needs. And I want you to take one or two of these needs and do sort of a deep dive. Think about how these needs, whichever ones you've identified, contribute to students' motivations to learn. How do these needs fit into a larger picture of what we're calling classroom management? And what might addressing these needs look like in your particular context? You can think about historically how you've dealt with these needs. You can also think about which, if any, of the suggestions provided by Jones and Jones might be usable in your own classroom context. Thank you all, as always, for listening, and please shoot me any questions that you have, and I will be excited to hear what you all have to say on this week's discussion. Cheers.